We're actually doing Nasso this week, so that's finally we're on the right Parshat. What? Oh, you're a week ahead. You're a week ahead. So you're doing Chazara this week. Okay, so maybe we'll trade. Let me give you the mic. But at face value, Nasso is a very interesting parsha. I think it's the longest one in terms of actual length. There are some double parshas that end up being maybe longer when they're put together, but when you look at it, it seems maybe a little odd to put all the things that you put in it. Like we start off with the story of the last two parts of the families of the tribe of Levi, Gershon and Merari. We discussed what they carry. Why not put them in the last week's parsha with Kahas? It would have saved a little bit of time. We would have balanced out on the length. Would have been nice. Then we have these amazing, fantastical stories of the Sota, of the Nazir. We bring in Birchas Kohanim, which is very interesting too. And then it ends off with this repetition of each of the 12 tribes' leaders doing their donation, and they're doing the exact same thing. It repeats basically word for word on a different day. Just, it feels like a lot to put into a parsha, maybe unnecessarily. So I guess you take a step back, you look at it again, and you say, well, how does it all fit together? How can we piece this together in a more meaningful way, I guess? And maybe to start with, we'll go with the bookends. So Gershon and Merari have their special jobs. In past weeks, we were talking about the fact that everyone has their own role. In Bamidbar, everyone had their own place in the camp. Gershon and Merari have their own roles. And Rabbi Sachs brings down on Parshas Nasso, actually, that one of the big challenges that Moshe is faced with is the challenge of being a leader, because people, they kind of get jealous. Hey, I wanted to be the leader, or maybe I wanted to be the Kohen. I talked about this last week also, or 2 weeks ago, when I wanted to get the rights of the Bechorah that were still, the rights of Levites, and there's a sense of loss perhaps. So maybe there's a sense of jealousy that comes up. And what's interesting is when you look at the beginning, it describes Gershon and Merari having to do the carrying of the cloth and the coverings, or the pillars and all of the frameworks of the Mishkan. And they seem, we're happy that they have their role. At the end of the Parsha, as we're going through all of these tribal leaders' donations, we find out at the end that Moshe separates a few of the agalot and the cows to help with the carrying. And we know that Kahat was carrying the internal kalim, so they weren't allowed to use wagons for this. But Gershon and Merari could benefit from this. So we see, in a way, perhaps the reason why we include Gershon and Merari in this week's Parsha is because it's going to connect with the ending of the Parsha, which is the donations of the tribes. And when we look at the donations of the tribes, it seems like they're all donating the same thing. I encourage everyone to look at the blue chumash with the English at the bottom. There's an amazing explanation of how each of the items in the donation corresponds to the way that the Bnei Yisrael came to be where they are. Each korban responds to either Adam or Noach, and the different parts of history that get us to where we are. There's a cow for Avram. There's a sheep for Yitzchak. Each one corresponds to the sort of lineage path, and it's reinforced that each one of the tribes has that path to get to where we are today. But Moshe, when he first finds out that they all want to do these donations, is resistant. He says, "We just had this story with Nadav and Avihu. People came and they wanted to give korbanot, or donations, that weren't being asked for. We can't accept those kinds of things." But Hashem says, no, these people are showing up honestly. They're showing up like with a pure heart, and they're showing up with the right intentions, so we can accept their donations. And that's how those donations end up being, again, a connection back to supporting the Levites in their role, without the people feeling like they're not being given the opportunity to do something meaningful. They're not jealous anymore of the role of the leader. they seem to be accepting their role as part of the nation and giving the donation as a result of that. So we've explored the bookends. Now the middle almost makes less sense. So if we have this connection, we've been talking about the donation, the setup of the camp. Why throw in the middle a topic of sota, a topic of nazir? Why throw those things in the middle of the parsha? Maybe Berchos Kohanim fits, although I guess if I was arranging it, I wouldn't necessarily have put it here. But if you think about it, the story of the sota and the story of the nazir and the story of Birkat Kohanim end up being a sort of like an aside, as maybe Shakespeare we would say, is a little bit of, a journey away, but it helps us understand the context in a better way. The Parsha talks about this, maybe just before the sota, as a tiny passage that talks about treachery against Hashem. Wish I could remember the word right now. Again, you'll see it inside. You'll find the Chumash. Something to look for. There they talk about stealing, but when it uses the same language in sota, it again uses this language of treachery, the same lashon. And why is the sota such a challenging story? Because it's a story of doubt, a story of mistrust. It's not a story where we know somebody did something wrong and therefore we have a problem with it. We have a story where the husband he's not sure if his wife did something wrong. It's unclear. As much as she says she did or she didn't, we don't trust that happened. And the way that the Mefarshim bring this down, it's that there's an imbalance in a way. I think the Zohar says this, that there's an imbalance between the midah of chesed and gvura. There's an imbalance between the acceptance and the judgment side of things. And this imbalance is what leads to this place of mistrust. And how do we solve it? We solve this by, there's a whole exercise of bringing a flower offering and then some sacred water. But the end, and this is maybe the part that we attach to, is that we write down all these curses and we scrape them, we erase them off from the cloth, and we pour that into the water, and then she drinks it. If she is a sinner, then she gets punished for it. If she's not a sinner, then she gets rewarded for it. And the idea, I think Rashi brings this down, is that when you have this imbalance between the man and the woman, what does Hashem do? He says, you're allowed to erase my name. In any other situation, erasing God's name would be not a cardinal sin, but like at the top of the list of things that thou shalt not. In this case, Hashem says, when there's that imbalance, you could take a step back from being overly spiritual and overly, remove me a little bit from the situation, and then bring me back in. And perhaps that's what connects directly to why the Nazir is the next thing in the Torah. Mefarshim bring down that the Nazir is a person who he does this as a reaction to seeing the sota. He does this as a reaction to seeing this position of mistrust and the fact that God needs to be separated. And because of that, he decides to take on this abstinence. He decides that he's going to separate himself and in a way become holier. Again, this is perhaps going back to the idea we were talking about before about connecting with leadership and trying to become a leader. It's a way that we see that Nazirut is actually possible. A person who is not part of Kahuna can actually reach those higher, loftier levels. But it's a way that a person can separate themselves in a way from seeing this position of mistrust. But what happens again with the Nazir? At the end of his term of being Poresh, at the end of his term, he also has to bring a korban. And there's a lot of different ways to understand this. One that I thought was very interesting is that, I think most of the Mefarshim say that it's because he was Poresh. He was separated himself from this world. He said, I'm not going to be in this world in the same way that a normal person will. He has to atone for that. The Ramban says the opposite. It's because he reached such a lofty height that because he says, I'm not going to stay there anymore, he has to atone for that. So there's interesting ways to think about this. But either way, it's clear that being in that state of Prisha is maybe not the way of the world, right? And perhaps that's what connects us to the last part of the challenging section here that we were talking about is Birkat Kohanim. We have the three blessings, Yevarechecha, Ya'er, and Yisa, and they bring down also the way that we should understand these is that they continue to be expanding levels of blessing. Yevarechecha is a material blessing. It gives us blessing in this world. Maybe it's also a blessing for growth. Some people say that this is where it starts to border on the second one of Ya'er, which is a blessing of Torah, a blessing of acceptance, that we are sort of happy with what we have. And then finally we have Yisa, which ends with a blessing of peace. And perhaps this is also a connection through those past few parts of the narrative that we were looking at, where a person is imbalanced in the physical connections that they have literally in this world, and then we receive a blessing that we can accept the way that things are. We don't have to be reaching for something that's maybe not in the way of teva. And the final way that we get that is that God will give us peace. Again, thinking about this from the perspective of leadership, what do the Kohanim do? They are Yisa at Shem. They put the name of God into the people, and then God does the blessing. Again, sort of reinforcing this idea that even though they have a role to play in doing the blessing, they aren't special blessers. It's not that they are given a special power. They're merely a conduit for blessings. So really kind of reinforcing this idea that we have, everyone has their own role in the situation. And perhaps this maybe is the way to understand the whole narrative here, is that, yes, in the context of understanding where we have our place, people may naturally start to feel a little bit of, mistrust and a little bit of, I wish I had that, and I wish I had this, and I wish I could be that, and those kinds of things, and not really be sure if the person on the other side is doing what their part of the bargain is. And they may want to be Polish a little bit. They may see different people's roles as things that they covet. We understand that everyone has their own role, and that in reality, perhaps they are just conduits for the will of Hashem, the will of God in the world. And you see the way that the Nasim showed up. Each one was given, they did basically the exact same thing. And yet they were all given their own time in the limelight. And at the end, they were all brought together and recounted. All of their donations were recounted as one. So the result of their action from showing up authentically was that all of this stuff was donated. The action that each of them took was that each one of them was given their time in the limelight as an individual. And perhaps that again connects back to the idea of Nasso. Nasso is counting. Nasso is, Nasi is the idea of leadership. Nasso is also this idea of Yisa, is to lift up. And maybe all of those things are, when we show up authentically, we show up with the right intention and understand that this is the best that I can do in this time, that it's going to be recognized in the right way.